Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to add a camera component to our character blueprint. And we're also going to take our mesh component and assign an animation asset so it's not just standing there with the arms out in a frozen pose. And we're also going to figure out how we can possess the character so that once we start the game, we can actually control the character's movement once we add that functionality. So let's dive in. Now we have our project open here, and I have this character that we've placed in the level, and it looks a little funny because it's just a capsule with these arms, and they're frozen in this pose where they're just reaching out to the side. So we're going to do something about that. Now we also need a camera component on this character class so that once we do start possessing it, our view will be from the point of view of the camera component itself. So I'm going to double-click FPS character. Now, after we've closed the character and perhaps closed the Unreal Engine editor and opened it back up, the first time we open the character blueprint, we're going to see this view. This is only the data view, and if we want to see the viewport, we can click Open Full Blueprint Editor. So if I click this, now I see the event graph and the viewport. Now here in the viewport, we need to add a camera component, and we can add components from the Components panel here. We have this Add button. If I click that, then we see several options. These are different types of components we can add. Now, for convenience, it shows some of the most common components, but what we want is a camera, and we can search using the search bar. So I'm going to search for camera, and I see that there are several options. The one we want is the first one that says simply camera. Now, as soon as I add the camera component, we'll see this blue camera here in the viewport. Now, I'm going to click in the viewport and hold Alt so I can rotate around using the left mouse button, and I can also click and drag with the right mouse button to zoom in and out. So here is the camera component, and we want this camera component to be roughly at the eye level. So I'm going to click the blue arrow and drag it up to where it's roughly at the eye level so that once we do possess this character, our view will be from the point of view of this camera component. Now let's talk about attachment for a second. I mentioned that actors have the ability to have components, and components are attached to one another in any given actor. And I mentioned that actors have at least one component, and that's the root component. In this particular character class, our root component is the capsule by default. That's one of the properties of the character class. They have a capsule built in, and the capsule is the root component. We cannot change that. Now, all of the other components are attached to the root component, which means when the root component moves, all attached components move with it. Now, another thing to take note of is if we scale the root component, all attached components will scale along with it as well. That includes the mesh. So if I take the capsule component and in the details panel, I change the scale in the X and Y direction to, say, 5 and 5, then you'll notice that not only has the capsule scaled in X and Y, but the mesh and the camera have scaled as well. And this is not what we want. So I'm going to Control Z to undo those changes. So I just did that to show you that you typically don't want to scale the root component like that. This is why the capsule component has the capsule half height and capsule radius. If we wish to change the dimensions of the capsule, we can change these values, and the attached components will not be affected if we change those. Now, components can be attached to one another in a sort of hierarchy. If I wanted to attach the camera to the mesh component, I could simply click and drag it onto the mesh component. And now we say that the camera is attached to the mesh. So if I select the mesh and I move it relative to the root, the camera will move along with it. Now, for our purposes, it's okay for the camera to be attached to the root, just like the mesh. So I can click the camera and drag it onto the capsule component, and now it'll simply be attached to the capsule component. So that's how attachment works in Blueprints. So now that we have a camera, let's see how we can possess this character. I'm going to compile and save and go back to FPS level. Now notice, now that we have a camera component, if I have this instance of the character class selected, we see a little camera view at the bottom right of the viewport, and that's showing us the view from the point of view of the camera on the character we have selected. And if I move the character, you'll see the camera view move as well. Now, if I press play and test this game in the PIE, you'll notice that I have the ability to move around. I can use the WASD keys and steer with the mouse. And this is not possessing the character. In fact, if I come back, I can see the arms of the character. The character is still just sitting there. This is because we are maneuvering what's called the default pawn. The default pawn has this built-in ability to fly around a level, and this is the pawn we possess by default. As soon as we press play, Unreal Engine spawns this default pawn, and we're controlling it. Now I'm going to hit escape to stop the game. So we don't want to be possessing the default pawn. We want to possess the actual character. That's the pawn we want to possess. Now, with FPS character selected, I can click on the Details tab here and drag this line up so we can see the Details panel a bit better. Now, I mentioned before that we see all of the components here in this little window. At the very top, we see FPS_character parentheses self. This means we've selected the character itself. We're not selecting any one particular component. If we do select one of the components, then we're looking at the details panel for that particular component. But if we select FPS character self, we are now selecting the overall character, and there are properties on the overall character itself. That's the list of variables that we see down here. In the details panel, I'm going to search for auto possess player, and we have this variable called auto possess player, and by default it's set to disabled. But if we click the drop-down, there are several options from player 0 to player 7. Now these numbers represent players in a split-screen game where two players are playing on the same game instance. So for our game, which is single player, we will only ever have one player, designated as player 0. So if we click player 0, then we're telling Unreal Engine that as soon as the game starts, we would like this character to be controlled or possessed by player 0. That's going to be the controller assigned to the first player in the game. And again, that's the only player in our game. So I can click the X on the search bar, and now if I hit play, we are now possessing the character. And if I click in the viewport to get control, I now do not have the ability to move around with the WASD keys. That's because we are possessing this character. And in this character, we have not yet implemented any functionality for moving around. We're going to have to do that ourselves. I'm going to go ahead and click Stop Simulation and go back to the FPS character. Now, if we click on the arms to select the skeletal mesh component, or we could click on Mesh in the Components panel, we can scroll down in the Details panel, and under Animation, we see a drop-down next to Animation Mode, and it says Use Animation Blueprint. We'll get to what animation blueprints are very shortly, but for now, we don't have an animation blueprint to assign to this mesh. But what we can do is click the drop-down and select Use Animation Asset, and we have the ability to choose an animation for this mesh to play. If we click the drop-down, and from this pop-up menu, we choose Arms Idle, we'll see now that the arms are in an idle position as if they're holding a weapon. And of course, the gizmo for this mesh shows us that we're in translation mode, which means we can click on the arrows to drag the mesh down. Now let's hit compile and save. And back here in the level, I can hit play, and we now see the arms. So this will take some adjusting, but we're now possessing the character, and the arms are no longer out in that awkward pose. So for your challenge, you're going to adjust the camera component, make sure it's at the proper height, and also adjust the mesh component. Now, we may be tweaking this from time to time throughout the creation of this game, but position the arms so that they look right in the view from the camera. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so we see that these arms are positioned a little funny, and we'd actually like them to be slightly lower. Now, this is the idle animation. We're not aiming. We have other animations for when we're aiming the weapon directly in the center of the screen. So I'd like these to be slightly to the right and down. So I'm going to go back to the FPS character, and I'm going to move these arms slightly. I'm going to position myself up at the top and select the mesh and move it over to the right. And from the side view, I'm going to move it down. Now, if I hit play, I'll see that the arms are down and to the right. Now, this is okay for now. As soon as we have a weapon and we start using other animations, we'll see if this needs to be tweaked a little bit further. So for now, I'm going to say this is good. Now, I mentioned in the last video that we're going to be compiling whenever we make a change. Now, when we do make a change, such as repositioning the mesh, you'll see that the compile button has a yellow question mark. And as soon as we click compile, it has a green check mark, indicating that compilation has been done. But if I move something and I get that question mark and then I hit play, you'll notice that we get that green check mark. So I can close this window and see that compilation has been done. So when we hit play, the blueprint will be compiled for us. Okay, so now we have a camera, we're animating our mesh, and we are possessing the character. So in this lecture, we have added a camera component to our character blueprint. We've adjusted the camera and the mesh, and we've assigned an animation asset to the mesh, so it's no longer just hovering with the arms straight out. And we've also possessed the character by setting its auto-possess player variable equal to player 0. So the character is starting to come along, but we don't have any ability to move around in the level. So we're going to get started on that in the next lecture. I'll see you soon.